Headcount Experts, Season 2, Episode 2, or Episode 11, however you want to talk about it. We've both been busy. I saw you announce a new capacity planning course, which is very relevant for what it is that we're talking about today, which is one of the best practices from last episode, which is how to plan capacity versus demand. How do you tell the business what's going on with the recruiting team so that they know the service they've purchased? They understand its capacity, their ability to have hires or revenue or production on time. And so that's what we're talking today. This is your expertise. This is why you're in the biz, baby.
Yeah, this is really my comfort zone. Coming from supply chain into talent, I just saw everything as a capacity planning problem, and which turned out to be incredibly helpful when I got pitched the problem to try and figure out why hires per recruiter was going down when we're investing in all this technology and tools and process improvement. Pretty excited to get into the weeds on this one, and it's definitely been the topic I've had the most questions inbound from my content on LinkedIn and YouTube, and it's one of the reasons why I decided to start creating courses.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be listeners from different levels of maturities or company maturities, let's call it. So there's going to be a range of, let's try to cover as much as possible. It's like how do you define recruiting capacity? What do you say to your customers, your clients? Like, what is that to you?
Yeah, so I think it's a mindset shift, really, going from I think how a lot of teams think about capacity is how many recs can I assign per recruiter per month, and then you get kind of your time to hire is really an output from that. But the capacity plan is really thinking through, okay, how long does it actually take to move through a funnel in order to get a hire out at the end of it? And then how many people do you need in order to make that happen at the speed that you need it to happen? So it's kind of going all the way back to Little's Law, where, we discussed in the last season, how do you think about kind of time in process and the amount of units you have in process in order to hit the goals that you need. It's how do you build a model that delivers exactly what you need when you need it, so you don't get surprised halfway through the year when you realize that your kind of hires to target is not pacing as you expected. I think long-winded way of saying, I think capacity is really just looking at the flow of candidates through the pipeline and the constraints that you have in order to move that flow more quickly.
And if I have an image of Little's Law, I will put it here. If not, I'm cutting this part. But just to visualize what it is that we're talking about from last season, from my end, it's just how many offer accepts can you plan per month so that if the team is asking for something, you know whether or not you can produce it. There's a bunch of inputs. We're going to get to that as to what determines hires per month. And that has a number of details, number of different perspectives from the team. But the capacity of what your recruiting team can do is essentially the service the business is buying from recruiting. So if you're an internal team, they're purchasing that service of hires per month with the salaries and the tools of recruiting. They could go to all agencies. They could have temp recruiters, they could have the hiring managers do it, and they're paying for it no matter what. But having a very predictable amount of hires you can make is important. Why is it important? So for any recruiter coming into this conversation for the first time, it's how a business predicts what's able to happen. But from your aspect, like when you're redoing capacity for either a customer or you've done it in your past, like how did you explain the benefit of a good capacity model to the business?
Yeah, so it's really about predictability. And we talked a lot about variance and how do you control variance. And if you don't know your capacity, you can't understand what the variance is likely to be. And so you're likely to always be behind. And really, if you think about TA as a kind of service-based business where you're serving the hiring managers across the organization in order to enable them to do the job that they need to do, they need to understand, when am I going to get this role filled? And what do I need to put into the recruiting activity in order to support that and get that role filled as efficiently as possible? And so the benefit really of actually having a solid recruiting capacity plan is that you can actually have very close relationships with the business, get those roles filled as kind of quickly as is reasonably practicable, but ensure that you can still maintain the high quality bar as well, which is really important. You don't just want to move candidates through and hire as quickly as possible and then find you have to rehire the role 6 months later because the wrong decision was made. So it's all about partnership, communication, and transparency, I think, between talent acquisition and the business. And generally, the people that are most interested in this have spent a career in recruiting, and now they're moving up to a management role where now, instead of kind of just getting the recs and trying to figure out how to manage, a group of 5 or 10 recs, they're actually looking at 100 recs over the course of a year and figuring out how to distribute them across their team. So it becomes a lot more of a kind of strategic challenge challenge. And it's the bridge between our like strategic plan and actually the tactical implementation of how to actually recruiters take those recs and kind of manage them in process.
Yeah, very important point that you just made. I'm not sure you know you made it. The person who cares most about recruiting capacity is the recruiting leader. And after that, it's a marketing campaign of getting other people to care with the benefits of doing so. So imagine a sales leader or an operator who has other stuff to do. They are not generally concerned about your specific recruiting capacity. So I have like personal opinions on the models that get down to the decimal points of hires per month, which I'm happy to share. But generally, what I found is that the business has other stuff to do. They've purchased recruiting as a service. They have recruiting demand. They expect it to get done. And the delta between what they want and what you can do is a marketing campaign that allows you to either unlock budget or unlock help from the business. And so there's a couple of styles of how people manage recruiting capacity versus demand. I'll flash this up on the screen. I did a comparison of quota-based hiring for recruiting teams versus a defined capacity model. But there are different styles of either incenting the recruiting team to produce or communicating that production to the business that all of the things we're about to talk about in this episode kind of roll up into. And so I think one of the main questions people have is, where do I start? How do I set a baseline recruiting capacity model? So I'm curious to know, what do you think the inputs are? So if someone's walking into a company for the first time, net new role, first manager, first recruiter, first getting promoted, like whatever the situation is, you're doing capacity for the first time. What are the inputs you look at and why are they important?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would want to take a look at is you look at historic. If you've got an ATS already in place, you can start to pull historic metrics and you can look by recruiter, what was the number of hires per month? And that's a very simplistic way of actually looking at capacity. But what you'll start to see is that some recruiters are hiring half a person per month if it's executive. Some recruiters are hiring 5 or 10 if it's entry-level sales or campus roles. And that quickly gives you a breakdown across the organization of like, where are we having efficiencies of scale within the recruiting pipeline? Where are we a little bit more kind of slower because we need to be? And so that kind of gives you a snapshot. And I think one of the mistakes that people might first make, especially if they're coming from outside of talent and moving into recruiting, is kind of assuming a flat quota for all recruiters. So if you say every recruiter should be able to close 2 per month, the campus team is going to take half the year off because they don't need to work that hard in order to make those hires. The executive team are going to be really struggling because they're never going to hit that target. And so having that breakdown, and in some of the models I've kind of demonstrated, I might have just like a simple three-tier breakdown where you have maybe entry-level hiring, experienced business hiring, experienced technical hiring, and each one has kind of different approaches, and that's going to result in different hires per month per recruiter. And so I'd say that's like the first metric, but I think you can really get a lot more insight when you go a little deeper, and you have to go deeper in order to have the additional part of recruiting capacity modeled out, which is how much support do I need from the business? How much interviewer time do I actually need in order to deliver against the hires that's needed? And then what is the time span of expectation for those hires? Because just because you open a role and you have the capacity to work that role, it doesn't mean that role is going to get filled in a week. It's still going to take the amount of time it takes to move people through the funnel and get them out at the end. So I would like initially start off. I'm curious how that differs from kind of your initial impression. I'm pretty excited to actually get into the weeds of actually by
Yeah, no,
stage, by activity level, time
yeah, I
series
think
data.
we have a lot of overlapping views, right? So just to reiterate the steps, you have a fourth step that I add. So like 1, I look at previous data to see what we've done in the past. 2, I'll segment the hires by category that makes sense for whatever business that I'm in. And 3, I'll look at constraints and what have been the constraints or outliers to some of the things that I've expected to happen one way, and how much of that constraint do I expect in the future. The only other thing that I do, if it's possible, is take a look at the information for the future and do this comparative analysis. So just like you said, if I see one segment takes longer and less hires per month and the future growth of the company is all that segment, I might not put as much stock in that old data set. But if the distribution looks relatively relatively normalized, then I will do that. And so by identifying what the baseline is and looking at the segmentation of demand and identifying the outliers or bottlenecks, I'm then able to kind of like draw a conclusion from what's happening in the future to say what to expect from this team today. And in some level, I don't know if I disagree with you, but I would say the total average hires per month. So I think we talked about this last time. It's like when a manager gets blocked by recruiting, their first reaction is top of funnel. And like in that executive mindset, the parabola of executive simplicity, I would probably give them a global. I'd be like, well, we get, 2 hires per month per recruiter on average. And it allows them to just make a quick math equation of like, all right, we need 10 more recruiters for these, 20 hires per month that we expect. And then I can distribute my recruiting capacity around production, which is one part of recruiting capacity, experience, brand, HR, cleanliness. There's a lot of different things a recruiter can do other than like be on the calls, although that is their primary job. I'll try to not sandbag it, but I'll come in lower, right? This is why I don't do decibels. I'll come in a little bit lower so that my team has additional capacity to take on some of the other stuff within the business. But generally I agree with where you're at as far as like how do I build a baseline target. But what's
I
next? So
think
you have
what you're
a
pointing to there is, something that I would really agree with, which is recruiting's not just a, number of recruiters running a funnel. It's an entire system. And there's many different parts of that system that are going to interact in order to improve the throughput. So measuring that flow rate and measuring the constraints that you have gives you priorities to actually solve for. If it is a top of funnel problem, you can hire sources. They're not going to be the recruiters that are going to be closing candidates, but they're going to solve your top of funnel problem. And they still go on your headcount, but they're not carrying recs. At that point, the recruiters that are carrying recs have to hire 4 per month because you've doubled the number of people on the team. And that's where it gets nuanced. And I think it's layered based on, to your point, where you are in the organization. So the TA leader is going to have that, okay, 2 recs per recruiter per month is what we're going to close. So I have a team of 50 people. Now, how I distribute that team is going to be, whatever delivers the highest quality in the most efficient way possible for the business. And hopefully the TA leader has a good enough partnership that they're not going to get too much pushback on that.
All right. I think you're kind of leading into a like the next focus of where we're going with this, which is like, what are the macro impacts on capacity? So one of them is the economies of scale of growing a team. And, we're talking recruiting here, but even with like a sales team, adding more AEs without enablement is likely not going to produce the growth curve that you're looking for the investment that you're looking for. So same with recruiting. We have coordinators, we have rec ops, we have sourcers. There's a lot of different positions that might enable other parts of the business that allow you to leverage economies of scale, et cetera. But from like a macro perspective, when you're looking at a company, you go into a customer and you're looking at the customer from 30,000 feet and trying to build them a capacity model. What are the things that you're looking at about that company to assess kind of your own, what do I want to say? How do you look at that company to kind of add your own correction factors to that initial capacity model that you build?
Yeah, I think the way I really like to start is like unit economics level, like individual hire. So we've already done the segmentation, and then you take samples from each of those segmentations. So let's say you've got 3 different types of hiring process that you follow. So you take one sample from a hire for a mid-level business manager, and then you kind of work back up the funnel. So we close that person. How many offers did we have to make to close that person? Then how many interviews did we have to make? And you kind of like work your way back and assume that the person is a good hire, then that becomes your essential perfect hire score. And so then you can actually start to set a baseline expectation of, in our organization, what does a perfect hiring process look like in order to get this perfect person in the seat at the end of the process. And once you've gone through that a few times with different roles, you can then start to kind of look for certain trends. So you're kind of like building up this picture of, okay, if everything goes right, then we get a great person. But where do things then start to go wrong? And that's when you can start to look at other data. So it's not necessarily applying one model to a new organization and then saying, oh, you should do this. It's kind of like starting with what have they done in the past that's been successful and what are they doing consistently? And then where are the potential issues where they're not getting that perfect hire in that perfect timeline? And then how do we actually kind of accumulate all the different kind of missed productivity based on that in order to figure out what's going wrong? So it's more starting with the problem and really drilling into the problem and then working backwards from there to figure out where are the factors, the constraints that are impacting that problem. It's ops research, supply chain theory, where you kind of like look at the overall flow and then figure out where the flow is not as smooth as you would like it to be, and then you identify the points of friction and work to solve those. So in that case, you're then looking at how the team is currently staffed and what that would be at a kind of a baseline organization that would be recruiting at a similar capacity level. So if you have a coordination team that is very efficiently moving people through the funnel, but then you don't have enough interviewers at the next stage, and that's where your friction is kind of coming in, and you're not moving candidates through because of that. You've identified the problem very quickly, and then you can start to figure out how do you actually solve for that problem. But I like that metric because it's easy to measure improvement. So you look at time in stage. An even better way to measure it would be overall candidate experience. It's a little more complicated to measure that consistently. So I'd really look at like what is the like number one metric that's going to tell me the health of the recruitment funnel, and then how do I look at that across the whole organization?
Yeah, I think, the more companies that I go into, so I started in consulting, but even with software, like I'll look at things just company wide, right? Before I even get to recruiting, I'm looking at things like, what is the headcount process, right? So do you do a rolling forecast? Does finance release all the roles? Does everyone just ad hoc? Do you manage to a budget? Do you manage to individual executive budgets? Do you use slush funds? So the idea that the headcount process itself may create the flow blockers that you're talking about is kind of like this macro, like 30,000-foot view. Other things I look at on top of the headcount process, like as determined by the business, is so how do you build a plan? How do you release recs to the recruiting team? How does your finance team look at underproduction from recruiting? Is that we're sacrificing revenue or are we saving OpEx? I look at things like market position. So are you the leader in your field or are you the second or last place? Do you have a good compensation position? If you're constantly paying below market, you're going to have lower conversion rates. And what is the existing team structure and size for all interviewers? And can you benefit from either kind of like macro process steps like reserved interview times or enablement ratios like having a scheduler or a scheduling tool or a rec ops person, right? So when I look at the health of a company, I'm trying to figure out what waters is the recruiting team swimming in so that I know how to like build a capacity model that reflects the success they're set up for. Before I even get into let's call it like micro capacity or recruiting only capacity factors. Is there any other like big part of how a company operates that you think impacts the people supply chain?
Yeah, I think you've kind of touched on I think we both touched on the two approaches here, and I think different companies are going to pick different ones. It's either like bottoms up, starting with the unit level data, or tops down, looking at kind of the overall macro vision of the organization, how things get done. I think really understanding the processes there, if you're going top down, is really important. So to what extent is the talent acquisition team involved in the headcount planning process in order to give feedback and set reliable expectations for how quickly these roles are expected to be filled, and then how much data is available to that team. And a lot of that comes down to kind of culture. Is TA part of the business, or is it considered a cost center that is pushed off to the side as like a service business that is
Right.
hired to do a role? I think setting that culture right and understanding how that culture is kind of developed throughout the organization is going to give you a good insight when you first come into a business and figure out what kind of problems am I expecting to see and how does that kind of relate to other problems that I've seen in some organizations. So I mean, culture is a little more wishy-washy than getting actually into the data, but it's so important because it drives so much of the decisions. And if you have a strong kind of business partnership and you have a culture where TA is respected and brought into those conversations, you're probably going to have a more efficient process overall. And it's actually going to be much easier to get things done when you do identify the issues and you have to figure out how you're going to solve them.
Yeah, I think I'm going to make a chart after this of like on one side is high production, on the other side is low production, right? And then all the categories are like, if you have a good headcount process or a proactive headcount process, you're more likely to have higher recruiting capacity. If you have a strong and integrated recruiting culture, you're more likely to have more recruiting capacity. You have a better compensation program, a nice market position, you have a good team structure. All of these things are going to kind of go from a macro perspective into the higher production zone. And then for similar, like getting into the weeds of like the individual impacts on a recruiter. So we do this a lot in Headcount 365. We look at the workload difficulty of a recruiter. So some of the more recruiting focusing. So once I know, where am I swimming, have what am I being asked to do? And the things that I'm looking at for those factors is like, how difficult is that individual requisition? How difficult are the hiring managers that I'm working with? Is there a structured prioritization framework within this business? And what do interview processes look like? And that's everything from the length of the process to how involved the recruiter is to scheduling. Do the managers show up? Is there debriefs? There's all these different kind of best practices you can do to increase capacity that are either owned by a rec ops person and published to the team, or universally owned by the business and operated by that kind of central nucleus of the recruiting process. So, on the micro side, this is where I see things like developing point scales for requisitions, or kind of building up to a assignment ratio per person. I want to get your thoughts on a point scale because it's contested, controversial. I think they're subjective to companies, and people have different ideas of whether or not hiring managers respond to them. But regardless of if you implement that point scale, those are the things that I think contribute to it. Am I missing anything? How do you measure an individual recruiter's difficulty or the capacity of that individual?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's actually one of the requests for additional information that I've gotten from some of my courses, because I haven't actually developed the point system because it is so unique to each organization, and I actually haven't used that in practice myself. What we would generally do is look at the kind of overall priority list and then give estimates of the amount of time based on the role. And there's the factors that go into it. To your point, how complicated are the hiring managers? How difficult is the role to hire for? What is the total market size for potential people, and where are they currently working? Is it actually going to be easy to pull someone out of a hyperscaling AI company to come and work at our small startup in Boston, compared to working in SF with everyone else who's kind of really growing in that space? And so there's kind of all those factors that are going to really play in, but giving realistic expectations of kind of rec load, and working with the senior leadership team to prioritize where those recs are going to come in, so you don't start kind of assigning points based on optimizing points per recruiter, but actually work more on a prioritization list, so that you don't kind of get ahead of yourself by hiring roles that are kind of even lower point, because you can kind of fit them in and wind up with people who are sitting in a role with no managers. I can definitely see the value in points, but having not used them in anger, uh, I don't know if I can really stand behind the kind of the operational process compared to really a robust prioritization process that's done in collaboration with the business in order to fill roles sequentially rather than kind of points based. I don't know what your take is on it. Have you used the points based system?
I don't like I like the concept of points. I don't like the execution of points. So in the world of, what's the name of your talent academy for everyone
The Meander
who's
Talent Academy. Yeah.
it's called Meander Talent Academy, a new segment for the headcount experts called Can It Data, brought to you by the Meander Talent Academy. The way that I look at points is a part of the workload algorithm that we're constantly iterating on within Headcount 365. For things like requisition difficulty, there's some data points like job level, and that you can pull directly from the headcount data. So job level, compensation, how many of that role exists? Is it a new job title to the business? So there's a lot of different things that you can say, like, oh, this might lower somebody's capacity to take on these roles. So if I'm a recruiter working all high level roles for big dollars where there's, they're all high priority to the business and they're all new job titles. I'm going to be spending a lot of time doing intake sessions, doing calibrations. There's a fall off rate in the funnel that's different. So, the requisition difficulty, I'm looking at things like headcount data, but I'm also looking at the external market. If I'm looking for a talent academy leader to take on my L&D role for the General Electric, there's like 4 of you out there that are qualified to do that role. And then you got to convince them to take the job and go get it. So there's things like, how many candidates exist, but let's go through these micro capacity factors, right? So requisition difficulty, hiring manager difficulty, prioritization, and process, right? What other things, besides the job difficulty on the requisition, what other things are you looking at? How else do you think about how hard an individual requisition is? What other data points can you pull from your business?
Yeah, I think if you've got a good recruiter who's been in the space for a while and really understands the market, I think their feedback is going to be more valuable than I think any data point that you can pull from a public source. So, I could say, hey, there's only 4 people in North America that could take on this role. But if you have a rockstar recruiter who knows personally 3 of them and actually has an inside track to one of them is thinking about moving on to the next role, then that's going to make that role much easier to close. And I think this is one of the dangers of the point-based system. And maybe you could take that qualitative information and quantify it in a points-based role. So even if you do have a difficult hiring manager, if it's this person's ready, they're fully qualified, they can do the role, like get on top of this person so that they make sure that the role gets closed as quickly as possible. It becomes more of a negotiation and a leadership challenge than a pure like points assignment challenge. So I think that the value of a good recruiter is kind of hard to quantify, but in that kind of situation, I think I've worked with some incredible executive recruiters who, even if they're not recruiting for a role, they just kind of maintain those relationships year round. They'll,
Yep.
Take the candidates that they want to work with out for dinner, and they may be involved with this candidate for 2 or 3 years, and then finally close them for a role that becomes perfect. And it's that kind of relationship building that I think is a little hard to quantify.
No,
I think
I
on the
like it. I
other
think,
end, oh, go ahead.
requisition difficulty comes down to uh, requisition level data. So, what about the job makes it difficult relative to the company? Market data, and then what you're quantifying here is the experience of the recruiter, which could be, everything from time to first candidate to source to application rate, the conversion rate from source candidates at top of the funnel. So, looking at historic data about those 3 things can help you kind of predict requisition difficulty. You also mentioned something about hiring manager difficulty. I have one that always, we track this in Headcount 365. It's always the eye opener for a lot of folks, but it's the tip of the iceberg as far as like tracking hiring manager difficulty is how many times did they change a requisition while you were working on it?
Mm-hmm.
It, there's other things. Do they show up for interviews? Do they reschedule? Do they do the debriefs? They fill out scorecards. I think we're coming up on tools that kind of navigate this type of thing. Let's go back. Fraud on requisition difficulty. I think the top of funnel conversion rate might be a new metric for requisition difficulty, which is the number of applications either associated with fraud or screened out or didn't respond to a first email, etc. I think that's going to be a net new to the world metric out of our scope or my scope of software development. But, the ability for a company to identify how much extra work that yields no result goes into each individual requisition is a very interesting stat that I might add. That's also very hot right now.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how that plays out. So I think we've kind of gone through these phases where, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that inbound channel was really valuable, but you didn't get a ton of fraud. And so it was generally kind of good quality candidates were applying and you could generally close them. And then we went through a period of growth where the theory was the best candidates are not applying. So we actually have to go to LinkedIn and go and manually source them. And then we came back to a position where actually you were getting good quality candidates inbound again because of the amount of rifts across the industry. but that's been conflated with all of the additional fraud that's happening. And so the question is, to what extent does that inbound channel become a kind of like a strong lever for bringing in good quality candidates, or do you then go back to more outbound where you're looking at things like, number of connections, kind of GitHub commits, and all the other kind of data points that you can pull in when you're looking at a potential candidate to kind of pre-screen out the fraud, because you're not relying on solely on inbound. And I know there are tools in the market that are trying to identify when fraud's happening, and
Right.
then you kind of get to the issue of, well, do you have the right candidates interviewing when you get onto a video call with them? Is it? I think we all saw that AI video of a candidate who got found out by the recruiter. But there's a lot happening right now that's going to damage the ability of optimization at the top of funnel. And so I haven't really seen anyone come up with an answer, or like clear direction on how that's going to play out. Have you seen anything from your end as you work with different customers?
I think Greenhouse is coming up with well, I don't know if I'm allowed to say. I think I am. Greenhouse is updating their API. It's going to give some more information. So I would be curious to see if I could pull in some indication of fraud per role. Like, there's going to be roles that have more of it than others, and I would presume it would be the lower level roles where it's a little bit easier to fake or experience, where an executive role likely won't have that same level. But TBD. I just think if I'm determining how difficult or how many, two things, there's two types of capacity, right? There's the business capacity that I'm explaining upwards, which is how many hires can you predict happen every month? When does revenue start? When does OpEx start? When does production start? This is my commitment to production. That's a production capacity. The other type of capacity is the workload distribution per recruiters. How many recs should each person have? I don't get too involved in the distribution of requisitions in like a broad market sense, because I've spoken to people who think it's totally fine if people have 8 and totally fine if people have 80. And there's so many different perspectives that are nuanced to how that business works and prioritizes, that I know that's something I think we dove in last season about. I want to say that was Little's Law again. Am I wrong? What was the other? What
No,
was
yeah,
the?
those are how many recs do you have? How many recs can you process per month? And that's going to give you how many candidates you should have in process at a given time, and how long it takes to close.
Yeah. So that is like the bringing together of two minds. This would be your zone. But I think, in determining like how much fraud someone's going to deal with, I presume is going to impact the flow of that requisition. I presume is going to lower their capacity to take on more work, which down the funnel or down the kind of production line, if you're handling less recs, we're making less hires per month sometimes. Okay, let's zip through the other things. Hire manager difficulty. I think quantifying this is extremely important, both for making a forecast, but also driving accountability. The way that I quantify it is the number of changes and their rate of participation in the interview and their availability relative to the total interview hours that we've calculated. So if you're a hiring manager and you have 3 hours of interview time and you're only doing 2 a week, that's a capacity issue that I'll factor into difficulty. What else on the hiring manager are you looking at? Like, how do you know whether or not you can add more volume to an individual hiring manager or not? What are you looking at?
Yeah, so I think ability to handle throughput is kind of one factor, but one of the factors that I would always look at is the pass through rate, not just for the stage that the hiring manager is at, but then further down the funnel as well. So if you have someone who's doing your initial screens, are they passing a large proportion of people through, and many of those are failing at interview, and in which case you're burning interviewer time that you shouldn't be, or are they not really passing many people through, and therefore they should kind of increase the flow? It's that like hose pipe analogy, and it gets kind of crimped at different sections. If you have a hiring manager who just thinks no one's good enough and they're just not passing anyone through, then the interviewers are not going to get a chance to go deep on that candidate. And so we actually started to think about an internal score for hiring manager or interviewer quality, where we want interviewers that are available, engaged, and can make effective decisions. That's where like interviewer training comes in, and interview intelligence platforms like my good friend Michael's Equitas platform and Screenloop that he just acquired is kind of like trying to solve that challenge and trying
Yeah.
to make interviewer feedback and quality less variable, which I think is one of the biggest challenges with picking an interview panel.
Yeah, and I think the tools like that. So I wrote this article for Unicorn called The Science of the Recruiting Funnel, but basically it just takes a look at milestone stages of interviews from the sourcing call, recruiter screen, hiring manager screen, team interview, offer accept, and how do you identify problems proactively and then fix them by either creating alignment, using things like intake sessions, interview rubrics to grow people. How do you calibrate net new roles? There's a lot of different things, and I think the data is the most difficult part to do. So one, those sessions take a lot of consistency, and then two, getting the data kind of homogenized into something that you can really draw insights from is probably something that a tool can do better than a person, or at least more efficiently. And so, assessing your hiring manager difficulty and then building a plan for it. I think what we're going to do for part 2, by the way, is apply all of these concepts in real situations. So, but yeah, I think once you know your requisition difficulty, you know your hiring manager difficulty, then you start getting into the prioritization framework, which is how many roles are the highest priority and what does that do to your commitments? Any thoughts on prioritization? Like, do you have a philosophy, a way you go about it?
Yeah, I think just ensuring that the prioritization comes from the business and there's no assumptions being made that aren't based on data. And I think that then prevents reprioritization, or at least minimizes the amount of reprioritization later. If you can get the priority right the first time around, you know when you say go and you start building that funnel, it's not going to get changed a month later, and you have to start to build a fresh funnel all over again. It just kind of creates that knock-on backlog throughout the year where you're not actually going to hit the goals because you didn't have the capacity, but because you're kind of constantly moving the funnels around, and there's a setup time cost with every new role.
Yeah, I think for prioritization, I always say if everything's a priority, nothing is. And so there's got to be some type of constraint to prioritization framework, whether it's on the percentage of the total recs in general or the percentage of active recs, some idea that it is a scarce resource that you're managing to a percentage. And then that way you can make a commit against it. So I can hit specific targets with prioritization frameworks that I can then measure later to see how we're doing. And then we'll have a more focused, and again, it's all about becoming more predictable.
I
I
think
think
maybe
the
one
last
one
part,
final point
oh,
on
go
that
ahead.
that's
Yeah.
probably good feedback for hiring managers is just because you have 2 recs per month, it doesn't mean you have 24 recs per year. If you don't use those 2 recs for the first 2 months, you only have 20 recs left for the rest of the year. You don't get those 4 magically back because you're constrained by the actual time a recruiter has by week and by month, not kind of over the course of the year. So I think it's just an important point to make. It's obvious to any of us that have been on this side of it, but for a hiring manager, they may just not understand some of the limitations there.
Yeah, we have a concept in Headcount 365 called actual demand or actualized demand, where it looks at how many times, like if I say I'm going to fill X per month and we don't, they don't go away. So what is that carried forward demand? And, the idea, this goes back into the macro stuff. Is like, do I front load everything if I have 100 recs and 100 capacity, but I want all 100 recs filled at the first 6 months of the year? You're going to have a different actualized demand than you are from what you would put on papers. Such is life. Okay, the last thing is the process side. I think we could go deep on this, and this might be a good place to kind of cap it. But the number of stages, whether you do exercise, I mean, we've all seen the nightmare stories on LinkedIn about how a process works and what's required. And there's some stuff that's kind of like objectively better or worse to a degree. And then there's some subjective stuff like, do I want to see all the candidates before I move anyone to the next stage, or do I want to move people through in real time? So there's different things. What are the major, when you're looking at the process, what are the things that you're looking at that impact someone's capacity?
Yeah, I have a pretty strong opinion on this because I've seen too many horror stories where candidates will move through the funnel and they'll have a really great candidate ready to go to offer, but the hiring manager says, "Oh, I want to see 3 more people so that I can compare them against each other and pick the best one." And what they don't often appreciate is that best person they already have is probably going to accept another role somewhere else, and maybe you don't get those other 3 people through, and then you wind up kind of taking 6 months to hire a role you could have closed in 3. So that's I really push for a structured hiring process, and the goal there is once you've taken a candidate through every stage in the process, you should have enough data points to make a decision. And it's not a decision which person do I hire out of this list? It's, should I give this person an offer? And so if it's taking more than 2 or 3 days to make that decision, there's probably something wrong in the funnel. And you have to change the system and change the process, not see more people and have more interviews. And so I just feel very strongly that that's the right approach. And if you get to the bottom and you still have questions about a candidate's ability to do the role, then either the interviewer hasn't got into depth on that kind of one process, or you didn't design the hiring process in order to kind of pull that out. So I think thinking about the processes, each stage is disqualifying candidates, and you're trying to figure out a reason why that person wouldn't be successful in the role. So you start off with the things that are very easy to disqualify, like, location or experience or even interest in the role. And as you get really, really down, that's when you get into the kind of case studies of actually putting someone in that position, simulated exercise, and figuring out, can they actually perform? And the reason that I like to structure it that way is because in a 20-minute call, you can disqualify someone very quickly on many different factors. And if you've already disqualified them, you're not going to spend 3 hours on on-site interviews. So
Right.
you're not burning interviewer time at the bottom of the funnel that could be better spent on people that are actually, are going to be a good fit. And I think this is it's a cyclical feedback loop as well, where every time someone goes through the funnel, you then check to see, do we actually have the right kind of layers built out in order to make this decision at the bottom. And once that's built out, you can then duplicate that for future roles that look very similar. Off my soapbox there, because I just see I see mistakes happen so much there, which damages candidate experience and damages quality of hire. And I think it's really important to get that right first time.
Now, I'll flash it on the screen. One of my first guest posts from a TA leader on Unicorn was the idea of optimal selection methodology. So doing kind of like a calibration interview. And then once you reach that threshold, you can pull the trigger without having any inhibitions, given what the success is of someone who goes through a process like that. All right. I think capacity is obviously one of the most intense topics. No surprise that we're going to bleed over into a part two. I think next week, we're going to do a demo of Chris's course on capacity planning. We're going to talk about scaling these concepts into communicating with the business and delivering a plan that has a measurement against it so that you can continually refine this process quarter over quarter, year over year, and use the information to just be a better TA leader, be a better finance leader, and create more predictable hiring. So recruiting capacity is obviously one of our biggest expertise and passions here at the Headcount Experts, and kind of a big factor in how well you'll hit your hiring plan for the future. So stay tuned for part two. Best episode ever of the Headcount Experts, and we will see everybody next week.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
All right.